So what we're going to look at tonight is the 2000s, the 21st century. And, you know, every time we've looked at racism and classism in these 100-year periods, I've tried to give it a title of a theme that you see happening. And for this one, I'm going to call it the racialization of the white working class. The racialization of the white working class, because it's at this time that we really clearly see the white working class being racialized. Now, we've seen this before. We saw this, if you remember, how Irish people got racialized by English people. They got portrayed as a different race. And we've also seen how the Bethnal Green poor people, they got racialized and talked about like they were another race. And we saw the stuff with eugenics, talking about how if the poorer people didn't have children, then that would be better for society, and how that led to stuff that led on to Hitler's idea of racial hygiene. And in the 2000s, you see this really clearly as well with the rise of this whole term of chav and all this chav hate that goes about, and the way that white lower class people start getting their whiteness brought up a lot. And I don't want to give everything away, we'll come on to it, but at the same time we're also going to see how there's also just the racism that we saw in the 1900s, how that carries on in the 2000s at the same time. So 1 minute we'll be talking about the racialization of white working class people. Next minute, in the same year, same time period, we'll be looking at racism towards African people in the UK, and see how they're both happening at the same time. To kick things off at the beginning, 2001, you get this term from a politician about a mongrel race. Yes, and Mr. Townend, a member of parliament, he said that there were ministers who wanted to turn the British into a mongrel race. Now notice how the British here are described as a race. Even after World War II, even after sociologists have said, hey, this idea of race is actually false, you've still got politicians who are using the term. And notice as well, the term mongrel is a term you use for mixing dogs. So possibly there's an implication here that there's a pure British race in his mind, and mixing it with other people kind of dehumanizes British people to become kind of like dogs. Okay, 2003 to 2007, you get a TV show called Little Britain. And Owen Jones has commented on this, and he said years later, he said, how has hatred of working class people become so socially acceptable? Privately educated multi-millionaire comedians dress up as chavs for our amusement in popular sitcoms such as Little Britain. And it's interesting, isn't it? You end up in this time period with all these very wealthy, upper middle class actors who act like so-called chavs, and they represent people from council estates, white people from council estates. They present them in a certain way where they present them as stupid, as having bad morals and everything. And this is part of the whole kind of racialization process. I'm not saying people are doing it deliberately. I'm saying it's the way of the flesh, like we talked about before. And if you like, you could say there are principalities and powers at play here, and it's all part of this attack on the image of God. Around the same period, you got 2004 to 13, you got the TV show Shameless, and again the way it was representing people from council estates was very bad. I could not watch this show. And you might say, oh, I got friends from council estates who love the show. That doesn't necessarily mean that the show is problematic. You know, you can be programmed to dislike your own people group. You can be programmed to be a ghetto snob. You can grow up in the hood and you can end up looking down on people who live in the hood. If there has been a lot of racism towards you, if there's been a lot of prejudice towards you, you can end up having that same mindset on other people who are like you. The key isn't, well, are there some people from council estates that like a Channel 4 TV show about council estates? The key is, how does God present image bearers? And does this TV show reflect that well, or does it actually do something to demean image bearers and actually end up promoting injustice and actually make it harder for people to be reached with the gospel? And I could go on and on with all the bad consequences of this. Okay, 2017. You might remember Madeleine McCann disappeared. Tragic event, family on holiday, leave her in a hotel room, and she disappears. Well, the following year, 2018, you might also remember that Shannon Matthews disappeared. And the way that these two stories were presented to us was really different. The way the media related to it was really different. And even though on my estate, like, it's interesting how people responded. And I think a lot of people were aware that had the McCanns been a family from a council estate, they would have been treated very differently by the media and by the police. Not to take away for a second from how tragic a situation that is, but on my estate, there have been very strong feelings about the McCanns. And I've heard middle-class people say, oh yeah, well, I know people who have strong feelings. And I'm like, I bet it ain't anywhere near the strong feelings that I know towards them on my estate. You know that if those have been lower class parents on holiday and they left their kid alone in the room, you know it would have been a different way it was reported. And Owen Jones has actually pointed this out, where from his perspective, you know, he said that Maddie appeared 50 times more valuable than Shannon Matthews. You know, not just the way the media coverage was done, but how much reward money was offered. And look at the way people talked about it. Melanie Phillips, she said that the Shannon situation, Shannon Matthews, helped reveal the existence of an underclass, which is a world apart from the lives that most of us lead, and the attitudes and social conventions that most of us take for granted. She's not the only voice saying similar things. John Waugh, the Kent Conservative councillor, said, there is an increasingly strong case for compulsory sterilisation of all those who've had a second child or third or whatever while living off state benefits. Okay, now, maybe you don't find these things problematic. Maybe they don't jump out to you straight away as, what? But were these things said in response to the McCanns about doctors and middle-class people? Like when Maddie went missing, did people start saying, well, there's a very strong case now for sterilising people who work in the medical profession? No, people didn't make that link. Okay, next one, Carol Malone. Speaking of Shannon Matthews' case, she said the mother and her boyfriend, quote, belonged to that subclass that now exists in the murkiest, darkest corners of this country. I think when she says sub there, is implying subhuman. That is scary. The Daily Mail spoke of the feral underclass. Now, all of this is language of a race that shouldn't exist. This is troubling language of how people are speaking. As a result of two people committing a crime, suddenly people start talking about this uncovered, hidden underbelly of humanity that should really be sterilised. It's very different to the rest of us. But they didn't talk this way about the McCann disappearance. So there's a difference here. Okay, 2008, Tayo, some of you know him. A seasoned Nigerian minister came to the UK and he started a training course that's well known. And Tayo wrote about it in this book here. He said, it appeared that all African and Asian pastors who came to Cornhill, that's the name of the training program, were somehow perceived as beginners in ministry, looking for knowledge from Western tutors. And he goes on, I've given you the rest of the quote so you can see how he was saying that wasn't actually the case, but that was how they were perceived. And so we see a problem in representation. Nigerian comes over who's been in ministry for years, who's had training in how to handle the Bible and everything, and white church leaders and trainers would naturally feel like, oh, this is someone who we need to train in some of this more basic stuff, not realizing how developed he and others are in ministry. The way in British culture we've had Africans represented to us mean that it's so easy for white people when they come into certain contexts to think that the African man standing in front of them doesn't know as much about them or anywhere near as much about them and need to be trained by them and, you know, maybe need to be taught the basics type thing. Now, speaking of British believers in general, Tayo found that when British people would ask him for a black African perspective on a Bible text, that they would relegate this to application rather than interpretation. So they would ask him, well, how would you apply this verse? But they wouldn't ask him, how do you interpret this verse? And again, it's this idea of assessment, of thinking, well, the white Europeans can do the assessment of the text. What does it mean? We can use our black African brothers for the practicalities of it, but we won't ask them how they interpret a text. And if you hear that and you think, well, surely because all the interpretation of the Bible's already been done, just read some commentaries and you find that on any one verse, there's a whole bunch of different interpretations. And pastors who've been to seminary, pastors who've got doctorates, are still each week when they're preparing for their sermon, looking at all the different interpretations and learning from white voices, different interpretations. So there's definitely space to hear from black voices on interpretation of the text too. Tayo wonders if British believers know, quote, from a position of humility, that they can also learn so much from Christians from other nations. They talk about learning from us, but this doesn't reflect in the posture of many. So in terms of the categories we looked at in the past of the image of God, this really touches on relationships, doesn't it? There's actually a hindrance between relationships between white British believers and black African believers. And for some white British believers, it's hard to have a position of humility to think they can learn something from their brothers. So it really impacts the relationship. A well-known white British preacher even told Tayo he couldn't see any need for the presence of African pastors in the UK. Now, speaking of the class divide, Tayo said, if this is real among the white British, the class divide that is, then it seems fairly clear that the black or Asian working class folks don't have any hope of genuine fellowship with their white middle class brethren. So notice here how class and race come together, like we've seen over the hundreds of years period that we've been studying. Tayo's pointing out that in Britain there's a class divide. And then he's saying, so what about people who they're not just working class, but they're black working class or they're Asian working class? How are they going to fit into church life? And I think we've seen that, haven't we? In that when people have tried to do outreach to different ethnicities, they've mainly reached out to middle class people from other ethnicities and not working class. And lastly, from Tayo, he warns us that the white majority churches must avoid the distraction of fighting for supremacy. Now, I just want to point out, this was in a book that was published in 2013. Okay, it was Tyler wrote this chapter in this book. You can see it in the footnote there. In 2013, he said this: what have we seen in the last year, particularly in America? And I think its influence has made its way over to the UK. A desire for white majority churches to fight for supremacy and to feel threatened by other voices. And back in 2013, we had an African brother warning us about this. We've had time to listen and hear if people were listening and hear. I think it's a good example of why we need the voices of different cultures to speak to us. Okay, remember I said we're going to be going like race and class and race and class. Now, 2008, Baby P, absolutely horrific what happened with Baby P. But look at the media response. The Sunday Telegraph had Bruce Anderson saying about Baby P, in the African bush, male lions who seize control of the pride often resent and kill the cubs fathered by their predecessors. In the London jungle, similar behaviour is not unknown. Okay, he's talking about the white lower classes here. He's using language which is animalised, racialised. It's reminiscent of the 1700s and the 1800s, right? This is the way people used to talk about black people. We've seen examples of this so far. And here you've got someone using this same language about the white lower classes. So this thing, you see this racism thing, it's not at its heart, at its core, it's not really relegated to colour. Like, it started in Britain before there was so much variety of colour. We had white slavery. It is something that is evil. It's something that's of the flesh. It's something that's of the devil. And it's something that will find its way into any nook and cranny. And if it can find its way to use colour as the excuse, it will do that. And if it can find its way to use class or the benefit system or whatever, it will do that. It will find whatever ways it can work its way into. 2007 to 2010, I personally started experiencing a whole bunch of jokes about chavs in Christian institutions and in public places and on social media, right? Just for the record, I hate the word chav, hate it with a passion. I'm aware that some people say, oh no, the word just means boy, which I think is highly questionable. But I think if you look at the law of common usage, how does the word actually get used? You find that you can find this very easily by doing a search on the internet. The word chav is often prefaced by the F word. It's often effing chavs. Okay, so it's not a term of endearment. It's not a compliment. As we go on to see some of the examples throughout this, you'll see the term is not used in a nice way. There are people who have said to me and said to friends of mine over the years, I've got a friend who does, and he's from a council estate, and he doesn't mind people using the word chav. That doesn't mean when you're around me, you can use that. It doesn't work like that. People should know that by now. You can't claim that you got some friend somewhere who said he gave you a pass. Like, it doesn't work like that. And yes, there are some people from council estates who use the word. And I've got friends who will use it to talk about other people on the estate. But what they don't seem to get, and I've heard middle class people comment on this, how this is one of the jokes behind it, is that my friends who use the word to talk about other people from the estate don't get that middle class people look down on them as chavs as well. So they kind of see it as, oh, the joke's on them. They're looking down on the chavs, but they're chavs themselves. So there isn't really many good reasons for using the word, but I will use the word here to help tell some important points. One day I'm leaving my front door, okay? A group of students see me. There's a lot of students round my way. And one said out loud, chav. And they all laughed, right? This is between 2007 and 2010. Social media comments around this time, I noticed they often included strong language, and appealed to the legitimacy of killing chavs. I kept seeing it on the internet, people saying how chavs should be killed. They should all be rounded up and shot. They should be gassed. They should be bombed, send bombs over council estates. What I also noticed was that when challenging chav jokes in Christian institutions, I received a mixed response from genuine apology, which was good, to you need to have thicker skin, which is unhelpful, but is often something that dominant cultures say to subdominant cultures. They say, oh, you need to have thicker skin, you need to get over it, rather than thinking, oh, are we maybe talking in an unkind way? Around the same period, 2009, there was a fitness chain called Gymbox, and they advertised a self-defense course called Chav Fighting. Okay, and on the advert, the tagline was, don't give moody grunting chavs an asbo, give them a kicking. The following year, you had a new TV show, Lee Nelson's Well Good Show. This show really frustrated me back in 2010 because Lee Nelson was actually Simon Brodkin, a formerly privately educated junior doctor who would pretend to be a guy from a council estate, and he would play him up as a guy who was really stupid and a guy who was a really bad dad. A lot of people thought it was funny. There were people on my estate who liked the show, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it was representing people from the lower classes in a bad way. That has a knock-on effect when you are from the lower classes and you go and see your local GP and they don't take you seriously, when you're dealing with the police and they treat you a certain way, when you're dealing with educational establishments and they treat you a certain way, all these things are influenced by the way lower class people have been represented in the media. So these things are really problematic. Okay, let's switch gears again now from class to race. 2010, Michael Gove said at Parliament, he said about the national curriculum that they were going to make changes. And he said that these changes will ensure that history is taught as a proper subject so that we can celebrate the distinguished role of these islands in the history of the world, from the role of the Royal Navy in putting down the slave trade. Okay, now we'll just stop him there for a second. Okay, now we covered how there was the African squad from the Royal Navy that was, after slave trade was abolished, was policing the seas to try and stop slave ships. We covered that. So, but it's a funny way of putting it, isn't it? It would be like if I were, sorry for the sort of this description here, but it'd be like if I was robbing your house one night, you caught me robbing your house, I'm robbing your house, and you're like, what are you doing? And then suddenly I'm like, this is wrong. I will stop robbing your house. And then, the next day I'm being interviewed by a reporter and I'm like, well, I think it's really important that everyone understands that I stopped the robbing of their house. You'd be like, well, you might have, but you started the robbing. Like, it's a bit of a funny way to present it. And then Gove goes on to say, to the way in which since 1688 this nation has been a beacon for liberty that others have sought to emulate, we will also ensure that it is taught in a way in which we can all take pride. Okay, so what he's doing here is recognizing the power of assessment in education. Okay, he's recognizing if we teach people, this is going to have an impact, how we educate them. But he's also wanting to teach them a whitewash version of history. Also, he later adds, we will do everything in our power consistent with commitments to basic civil liberties to ensure that racists cannot poison the minds of young people. Now, in the context, I've given you the link there, you can look up for in Parliament. Parliament give publications of all these things so you can read it line by line. In the context, he's talking about stopping the BMP from being school teachers. Okay, which is probably a good idea, but notice he's limiting racist ideas to the BNP. So it's this idea, well, we as a party are actually going to stop BNP members being school teachers, and not realizing you could still be teaching racist ideas. You could still have racism being perpetuated in education, even if you don't have BNP in there, because racism is not limited to the BNP. Okay, 2010, they discover something about Neanderthals. You might remember Neanderthals mentioned before. When Neanderthal remains were found, years before, they said, oh, these Neanderthals are the predecessors, the ancestors of the Aboriginals. And they said, you know, the Neanderthals were very simple. They couldn't do much. Simple, and they viewed it as simple like the Aboriginals. Well, in 2010, they discovered that Europeans have 4% Neanderthal descent. And in 2014, this was confirmed. Okay, now what's really interesting is once Europeans discovered that actually they were descended from Neanderthals, the view of Neanderthals started to change. And in 2018, Swiss and German researchers said Neanderthals might have had a sophisticated cultural behavior. And you can look this up and you could see how now scientists will say like, oh, we think Neanderthals could sing, they could make music, and they could make water systems and everything. They were very advanced. But that's only since they've decided that Europeans come from them. What this shows us is that scientific assessments are not necessarily neutral. When you're studying, when you're looking at the data, it's very hard for us to be impartial. We do get influenced by these things. 2011, Mark Duggan was killed by the police. There were subsequent riots, and notice what the media response was. So you had the lead singer of Travis call it Chav Spring, okay, basically naming it after the Arab Spring. So notice again here, racialized language. The fitness chain, Gymbox, who did the chav fighting thing, they called it a chav infestation. 2 days into the riots, there was a poll in which 1 in 3 people supported using live rounds on rioters. Okay, that means actually killing rioters. 1 in 3 people in this poll said it'd be okay to shoot them with live rounds. You might remember David Starkey on Newsnight. He referenced the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech that we mentioned in the 1900s. And then he said, the whites have become black. And he also said, a substantial section of the chavs have become black. And notice here, the racializing of white people doesn't then alleviate how black people have been treated. It's not like, okay, we're going to point our hatred towards chavs now, and now we're going to be nice to black people. It doesn't work like that. Instead, it's like we're going to racialize lower class white people, and we're still going to carry on demeaning black people. And what you see here in David Starkey's view is that both black people and white lower class people are seen as of lower value. And the Daily Express wrote, we have bred feckless, lawless males who pass on to their own children the same mistakes. Now that just echoes of eugenics. It echoes of racial hygiene, of racial purity, all these ideas that were part of what we fought World War II over. And this was just 10 years ago. This stuff's being said in the papers that people are reading, they're breathing this in, as it were, and then breathing it back out. 2012, Nicola Rollock, an academic, she came up with a 10-point survival strategy for navigating a white world as a black person. And one of the things she brought up was lowering her tone when speaking about race. And we talked before about being made in the image of God. Part of it is about having a voice. And here you got an example of an academic who in 2012 was like saying, when I talk about race, I have to lower my tone so that I can survive around white people. Between 2011 and 2013, there was a documentary on BBC called The Future State of Welfare. It was aired in 2011, and the Child Poverty Action Group complained about it because they said that it had the myth of dependency culture. And in 2013, the BBC Trust acknowledged that the show breached impartiality and accuracy guidelines. This is straight from the BBC website itself, from the BBC News. You can read about this if you want to look up that link. So one of the problems here is a TV show gets put out there and gets put on iPlayer. Loads of people watch it live or they watch it later. And then when people complain and say this is perpetuating that myth of dependency culture, the people who make the show can apologize. Maybe they'll take the content down. But already people have been infected with this myth of dependency culture. And this is why I chat to people and we chat about problems on council estates, and people are like, oh, well, surely the number one problem is like the dependency culture. Surely you've got a bunch of lazy people in the lower classes. They don't quite put it like that, but I'm like, there's lazy people in the middle classes. There's lazy people in the upper class. Like, laziness is a human thing. There's rich people who are dependent on their parents. There are rich people who are dependent on the tax loops that they have used. But these myths get put out there and people get represented the wrong way. 2012, in the preface to the book Chavs, the demonization of the working class, Owen Jones points out, and I think this is a really big point here, and this ties in nicely with stuff that Akala says. Working class has been racialized to white working class. I'm going to just read that bit there again. Working class has been racialized to white working class, making their problems linked to their whiteness, not their class. I'll read that second bit again. Making their problems linked to their whiteness, not their class. In other words, working class people used to be called working class. And there was this understanding, maybe you had difficulties in life and part of that was because you were working class. But at some point, people started calling us the white working class. And it was a term that stuck after a while. And it meant that then people started thinking, yeah, I'm white working class. That's part of my problems, not just that I'm working class, but that I'm white. Whereas Jones argues that the problems are to do with class. And he argues, and this is really important, these problems that are to do with class, they're faced by ethnic minorities too, who have to face class problems as well as extra problems. Okay, so basically what we're saying is in Britain, there are class problems. Okay, and if you are a white working class person, you are facing problems because you're working class. If you are a black working class person, then you could be facing problems because you are working class as well. And you could also be facing extra problems because you are black as well. Now, you might even be like, black working class, that's not even a term I hear a lot. Isn't that interesting that we don't hear that term a lot? Why do we keep hearing white working class, but not black working class? Does being black mean that you are immune to being working class? Or, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's interesting the way that our assessment about these things has been conditioned. And Akala says some similar stuff that we will come onto later. Okay, 2013. Mike Philpott, absolutely terrible what he did. But look at the Daily Mail front page headline. They called him a vile product of welfare UK. So they're linking him being a murderer to benefits, to people receiving benefits, which I have a problem with. As some of you know, it's one of my pet peeves when people talk about benefits and benefits culture and people on benefits, because all parents in the UK for many, many, many years have received child benefit. So if we're going to talk about benefits, then we're not talking about the lower classes. We're talking about parents as well. And so anyway, but Owen Jones argues that the association of this murderer with the lower classes is inconsistent because when Harold Shipman was found out as a murderer and he was a doctor, they didn't associate his murdering with doctor culture. They didn't say vile product of doctor culture. Yeah, no one said that. So here we got a problem with representation, how people are being represented. We've got a problem with assessment and how people are being trained to assess stuff. People are being trained to think, oh yeah, you receive benefits. That's one of the reasons why you're a murderer. And the paper is using its voice to get people thinking this way. Newspapers are also a form of enjoyment. So this is a form of enjoyment that is actually being used. This is, you remember these functions we looked at before, how these are the functions that God's given us as image bearers to spread his love. What the devil does is he piggybacks these things and twists them to try and spread his kingdom. So you have a form of enjoyment, newspapers, which is then twisted to spread this bad representation of people, which then affects relationships, makes it harder for people to be friends with people who are from the lower classes, because in their minds they are associated as murderers, or as some people say that chav stands for council housed and violent, which can make it hard to build friendships with people when their wives are thinking, oh, this guy might be a bit violent. 2013, BBC Three had a reality show called People Like Us. And what was interesting about that show was that the residents in the area, they complained and said it presented a biased and distorted view. But sadly, loads of people saw this representation of people on council estates, having them misrepresented to them. The next year, you all heard of it, Benefit Street on Channel 4. As a result, Benefit Street, I think, is also problematic, the way it portrayed people. But look at how social media responded. There were calls for the participants on Benefit Street to be killed by hanging or gassing. Okay, hanging, you remember all the lynching that used to happen to black people, gassing, popular way that Jewish people were killed by Hitler. Okay, this stuff should deeply trouble us. That the general public is asking for this. This is reminiscent of Hitler's racial hygiene, of Galton's eugenics. You know, this is serious stuff. It starts off with talking. You know, Diane Langberg talks about Rwanda and says how before people were running down the street with machetes and killing their neighbours, people were calling their neighbours cockroaches. It started with on the radio hearing people say the cockroaches to speak about the other people group. And over time, you get so used to thinking of someone as a cockroach, you don't think of them as human anymore. Lopping their head off with a machete it's not as difficult as it would have been if you'd seen them as human. Shift gears again, 2014, one extra named Ed Sheeran as the most important UK artist in the black and urban music scene. And Wiley had something to say about this. He said he is sick, but which is a good thing if you're not familiar with the terminology. He says, but black artists in England, we are getting bumped. We influence a man and all of a sudden he has influenced us. So in other words, he's saying we influence Ed Sheeran and now it's being talked about like he influenced us. So oh my days. Okay, 2015, Mark Maynell wrote, this is a white middle class church leader and author. He wrote, we might assume we are immune to propaganda. Here he's talking as a white middle class person. But as renowned French sociologist Jacques Ellul warned, it is the educated who are most vulnerable to its effects, because they absorb more second-hand and unverified information than others. They like to have opinions about everything, while at the same time entertaining their own ability to make judgments. And that's really interesting to me, because there you got a middle-class guy saying the middle classes are more likely to be tricked by propaganda. Yeah, I would say we've grown up in a society that tells us that the working classes are the people who are more likely to be duped than the middle classes. And that's really significant when we ask ourselves the question, how have the middle classes been duped to view lower class people in Britain? And how have they been duped to view black and brown people in Britain? And duped to view any ethnicity in Britain? Okay, 2015, Kingston LSCB, the local Safeguarding Children Board, they had a case review about a middle-class family where there was some child protection stuff. And in the report, they said the impact of the couple's class, background and culture was significant. And then you have the father saying how the experience of being told what they needed to do for their children was a new and unwelcome experience for the parents. When I read that, that was really interesting to me, because I was like, from my background, you just understand that when social workers step in, like they are now telling you how to do things. And if you don't play ball, there's going to be serious ramifications. But that's not everyone's experience. That wouldn't seem like a standard thing to most people. And then if you look at the next paragraph, it says also significant was the couple's affluent middle class status, which together with their assertiveness posed challenge to professionals, some of whom would not be used to this level of questioning. Now, I actually found that a bit disconcerting, because I was like, so the middle class man, when he's asking questions of the social workers, saying, hang on a minute, and they're not used to that. And that does concern me a bit, because that, to me, that suggests that we have a culture where it's just seen as a given that the lower classes wouldn't question too much what the social workers are going to do. Might be reading too much into it, but it says this was particularly the case in dealings with the father, who as a lawyer and a company director was experienced as powerful. There has been consideration whether the family's social status led to a different safeguarding response. There is no evidence that this occurred, but may have contributed to the cautious approach in moving into child protection processes. So they're saying we didn't find any evidence that happened, but it might have contributed to us being cautious. And I read that and I was just like, I hope you were cautious. You know, when we're looking at issues that can involve children being separated from parents, which for the lower classes is sadly too common a thing to happen, I hope that there is caution, and that it's not just caution when the person is middle class or when the person is a lawyer or seen as powerful. And there was a social worker who did a blog post about this, and she said, in my view, attending a child protection conference is a very different experience when the parents are middle class. Now, she's writing from the perspective of a social worker who sees child protection on lower class children as being the norm, and then seeing it as when middle class people are involved, then we have to act very differently, and that's not so good for the child. And I appreciate her perspective, but I can't help also wondering, well, is it possible that when social workers deal with lower class people, that they are then more likely to take children away just because of the classism that exists in our society that impacts all of us, and the way that assessment and the way we assess lower class people, the way we use our power to serve and protect or to manipulate lower class people, how much of that is at play. And also just the fact that, you know, a lot of social work offices are based on council estates. So there's already this kind of mindset of taking away children is something that's done to the lower classes, not so much to other classes. Okay, 2015, the Northeast had the highest knife crime figures in the nation. Okay, I think that is England and Wales. You can get down deep into the stats on if you want to look up the Home Office stats for it. It's probably easier to see newspapers report it. Akala has talked about this, and he's pointed out that the London press associate knife crime with black boys. He says, in reality, class is a far bigger factor than race in this issue. So in other words, if you were to say, who commits the most knife crime in the UK, you would be like, it's white people, it's not black people. But in the papers, who is represented as committing the most knife crime? It's black boys. Why is that? And Akala, I've heard him say many times in different interviews and stuff, say whether you're talking about Scotland, England, Scandinavia, you see knife crime is high when you've got economic problems, where you've got class problems. So you could have an area where knife crime's high and black boys are involved, but class is involved as well. And you could go to another area where knife crime is happening and there's white boys involved, but again, class is at play. So we see that this relationship between class and race is really linked. And too many people, I would say, keep wanting to scapegoat people for, they want to scapegoat black boys instead of actually considering, wait a minute, are there class issues here? Are there poverty issues here? What happens when you have a neighborhood that has faced poverty, no matter what ethnicity they are? If it's the same problems, then we know we need to deal with those problems and not just think, oh, this is a black thing. Having said that, just to make sure I'm representing Akala fully as well, Akala has also said, it is possible that there is a factor, one small factor amongst many, because obviously these problems are all multifaceted, isn't it? Like no one's saying, well, maybe some people are, but I'm not saying knife crime is down to one thing, you know. But Akala has said that it is possible that you could have someone who has internalized the racism that they have experienced to a point where they don't value someone else's life, that it's easier for them to kill them. And I would say all over the UK, we have seen young people not see other young people as made in the image of God. And it's way easier to kill someone when you don't see them as made in the image of God. So, yeah. All right, 2016, David Olusoga's book comes out, Black and British, A Forgotten History. Well worth reading, but it's a big book. If you've got it on Kindle and you're wondering why it's taking you so long to read, this is why. It's a hefty book. But I think it's a very significant book coming out. Same year, we had Brexit referendum. And as a result of that, there was an increase of hate crime. In the month after the referendum, there was a 41% rise in racially and religiously aggravated crime. In the week after the referendum, there was a 58% in these crimes. 2 months later, you had 40-year-old Polish man, Arek Joswick, he was murdered. And you had 31-year-old Czech man, Zdeněk Makar, he was killed. Same year, the Galton Institute, which had been renamed from the Eugenics Society in 1989, they started the Artemis Trust to provide fertility control, which is especially for, quote, poorer communities, end quote. That should be very disturbing to us. That's like going back more than 100 years, which again shows these ideas from our past, they echo into the present. We should learn from history and say, what's that fertility control for poor people? We've been there. We know where this leads to. 2017, according to Scientific American, a journal, there was an unfortunate resurgence of Charles Murray, and we looked at Charles Murray in the 1900s. 2017, you had Charlie Gard, that poor little baby, and there were similar medical cases with working class families where the working class families were seen as duped and not understanding the science. So you'd have a situation where doctors might be saying, we're going to turn off the life support. You got a lower class family who's saying, hang on, we'd like to try a different option. We've raised the funds for it. We've got someone who's going to help us out with this. And what I kept hearing was, and I heard this from Christian leaders and friends of mine, which I found quite upsetting, was this whole thing of, oh, this poor family, they've been duped. They don't understand the science. And particularly when people are talking about stuff to do with brain dead, quote unquote, if someone says they don't understand the science, I'm straight away like, whoa, have you looked into the science of being brain dead, quote unquote? Like, it's got a bit of a murky past to it. But the thing is here is there's this stereotype that lower class people aren't able to evaluate stuff. And yet at the same time, we know as well, if it was a wealthy family who was saying, actually, we'd like to take our child to this other hospital where a doctor said he's got a treatment he can try, people would be like, sure, go for it. So I find that problematic. 2017, Reni Eddo-Lodge published a book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And in it, she said that white people have never known what it means to embrace a person of colour as a true equal, with thoughts and feelings that are as valid as their own. I think that's the kind of thing a lot of white people would straight away feel the need to kind of defend themselves about and say, no. But I think, given what we looked at the history of all these hundreds of years, what's been going on, in Britain, we have seen this mindset that black people aren't able to think as well as white people. And I think it would be naive and premature to have the knee-jerk reaction of saying, oh no, of course, I see all black people as their thoughts are just as valid as mine. I think we really need to be honest, to be like, hang on a minute. If I've lived in a country that has a history for hundreds of years of thinking this way, is it possible I've been sucked up and influenced by that as well? She also talks about if she expresses frustration, anger, or exasperation at their refusal to understand, they will tap into their pre-subscribed racist tropes about angry black people who are a threat to them and their safety. So what she's saying is if she expresses frustration, people have already got in their mind these kind of like figures of angry black people, and they will be like, oh yeah, you're one of those angry black people, straight away. And I think that white women probably can understand this better than us white men, because you know what it's like when us men do that to you, right? Where it's like, oh, you're being emotional now, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that white women have got a better understanding of how this works. She says it's truly a lifetime of self-censorship that people of colour have to live. The options are speak your truth and face the reprisal, or bite your tongue and get ahead in life. So she's talking about how she's not really able to fully use her voice. She says, I'm only acutely aware of race because I've been rigorously marked out as different by the world I know for as long as I can remember. So, you know, I hear some white people say, oh, why are black people always going on about race? Well, we've got someone made in the image of God here who's saying she's only aware of race because everyone around her has marked her out as different from day one. We live in a world that is racialized, where we mark people out. But she also says, I won't ever stop myself from speaking about race. Every voice raised against racism chips away at its power. And I find that really interesting in terms of how God uses our voices to spread his loving rule broadly and deeply. And she has recognized that voices can be used to chip away at racism's power. Okay, 2017, we had Grenfell, absolutely tragic. And it showed the low value that was placed on the tenants, from the cladding that was put up there, to the aftermath that is still going on and how there hasn't been justice yet. And Grenfell shows us problems with both racism and classism. The following year, you had Afie Evans, which is similar to the Charlie Gard case. I've put a link there to blog post I wrote about that. 2018, we had the Windrush scandal. And it's a terrible scandal. What I'm amazed about is how many people still don't know about it, or how many friends, when I've brought it up with, have straight away defended against it, just assuming there's no way our government would have done anything like that. I would urge you to research the Windrush scandal if you don't know about that. 2019, I guess in some of our circles, this is kind of significant. Oak Hill did an Image of God conference. They had Felix speak on the image of God and race. And they had me do a talk on the image of God and class. I've just put a couple of the highlights down there. I think it's encouraging to have a seminary ask people to talk on these things. 2020, we had Belly Majinga die. We had someone spit at her and say they had COVID, and she died. And it's one of those ones where it still hasn't been resolved, and there's still questions about the way it's been dealt with. And even if you're someone who is of the opinion that what happened to Belly was not a racially motivated attack, even if you're of that opinion, it's worth asking yourself the question, why are people not satisfied that this has been investigated problem? Why there's so many questions? And you've got to conclude there's been so much distrust build up over the years with so many similar cases. So even if you could show one case where you could say, hey, people thought this attack here was racially motivated, but we found out it wasn't, you will find 9 other cases where there was a racially motivated attack and it didn't get dealt with properly. Do you know what I mean? Or it'll be like the time where I had a family member who was attacked, and I turned up at the scene. I see the police, and I'm like, "What information can you give me?" And they say, "Yeah, they was attacked by two black boys," and so words going around the estate, oh, there's two black boys out there that have just mugged one of Duncan's family members. Later, I found out it was two white boys. No one in my family has said it was two black boys. Why did the police tell me it was two black boys? Like, do you know what I mean? So what I'm getting at is there's been enough dodgy things happen that even if sorry, I'm repeating myself. Anyway, 2020, check this out. There is a so-called scientific journal called Mankind Quarterly. Now, there are scientists that write for this journal, okay? But the people who funded this newspaper and all that, people who are into white supremacy. And so please don't think like, oh, Mankind Quarterly is a scientific journal that everyone's reading who are doing science degrees and scientists and all that. But unfortunately, there are enough scientists out there who are into white supremacy that they do actually contribute 4 times a year to this journal. And they had a scientific paper in it in June of last year arguing that the higher COVID-19 death rate amongst ethnic minorities is due to intelligence. So we know that ethnic minorities were dying more from COVID. And this is what they said, quote, "It is hypothesized that intelligence has both direct effects by making people more able to avoid infection and indirect effects through socioeconomic conditions and through lifestyle factors that can lead to chronic health problems." What they did in this paper was basically what they were saying was that ethnic minorities aren't as good at assessing stuff, So what happens is they get themselves in situations where they catch COVID because they don't have the intelligence to not be in those situations. What they're doing with this paper is they're representing ethnic minorities as not being good at evaluating stuff. And this paper is using its voice to kind of spread this message of white supremacy. And it's not just this scientific paper. The following month, 2020, the book, The Bell Curve, which we talked about in the 1990s, the Charles Murray book, on amazon.co.uk, it had a rating of 4.7 out of 5 with 350 reviews. And on goodreads.com, it had 3.5 out of 5 with 2,437 ratings. There are people still reading it today who are saying, what a great book this is. So we are living in a century today which is still carrying on ideas that influenced Hitler, that's still carrying on this mindset of race, that is applying it to black people, and it is applying it to white working class people, making them think that their problem is because they're white. Then you might be like, well, how does that work, making them think their problem's white? Well, if they're thinking their problem is that they're white instead of that they're lower class, then what it means is the enemy is anyone who's not white, anyone who's black or brown. Instead of realizing there's poverty problems here that need to be addressed by the people in power, rather than getting angry at anyone who is not white. Okay, well, that is it. That is actually the end of our historical survey of classism and racism in the UK, going through right from the start. And obviously a lot has been missed out. It's just touching on some key things that I thought were relevant with regards to the image of God. Has anyone got any questions? That is such a great question and such a difficult question to answer. I think for anyone who comes to the realization that the term chav is an unhelpful way of representing someone made in the image of God, and that even if it works in your little friendship group, you kind of end up perpetuating a myth that goes further. I think even if you come to that realization, to persuade people in your group of that is really hard. And it might even be that that's not actually the right thing to do right now. And it might be the kind of thing that people will always disagree over. So, just like there are debates, for years there have been debates that black people have had about the N word. I got some friends who use it. I'm talking about black friends, who use it. And they use it to what's the word? Forgotten the term now, but to take the sting out of the word. Like if you use it for your friend and you say my N word, then it's a term of endearment and, that kind of thing. And then there's other people who are like, no, there's no way we should be using that in the black community. And over the years, there's never been a consensus. Like not everyone is totally agreed on how to use that word, although obviously it's agreed that it's understood in general white people shouldn't be using the word. And although it's got a different history and it's not as bad a word, but it's still a problematic word, I think the word chav is similar in that we won't agree on it. And I certainly don't feel that I need to persuade all Christians to not use the word chav. I think my friends who are middle class, who didn't grow up on council estates, for them, I've got no problem saying to them, mate, you really shouldn't use that word. Like if you're using it in an academic sense, then fine. But if you're saying to anyone, oh, my chav mate, Duncan, like, that's really going to cause a problem in our relationship. But I don't feel called to try and persuade the whole Christian community to not use the word. So I don't know if that helps. I guess what I'm saying is maybe think about timing and maybe part of it is to present people with a better vision of what it means to be human. So that instead of people thinking like, oh, isn't it kind of funny that we kind of act like so-and-so on Shameless? That instead people have more of a vision of being what Jesus was like. There's plenty of ways that Jesus has similarities with council estate men. I mean, look how blunt he was in the way he talked. Like, he would be really blunt with people sometimes. He was a great storyteller. He's like the bloke down the pub that's always telling stories, So, like, that is a better vision for us, for what we can be like. And then same way there's biblical women like Tamar, who with a tent peg takes out the bad guy. It's like that's like one tough old council estate cookie there. It's like, so we've got these other images that we maybe need to be promoting more than we don't necessarily have to tell people, oh, don't watch Shameless or anything like that. But instead we can be being louder, using our voices to present these other images. Yeah, that's a good question about should you use the term white working class or not. I think because I think these topics about racism and classism are so difficult, and in my mind in the UK, not enough theologizing has been done about it to date. I feel like the stage we're at of understanding about it is like we're just at the foot of the mountain. From the Christian perspective. Like, I'm not saying that in the UK there hasn't been a lot of thought about racism and classism, but I'm just talking about in the church, there hasn't been a lot. So we're at the foot of the mountain. So I always want to be careful about being too dogmatic about saying what we should say and what we shouldn't say, because then maybe in 5 years' time, when we understand things clearer, we'll be like, actually, it is helpful saying this, or it's not helpful saying that. But for me personally, if I'm using a term like white working class, similarly to if I'm using a term about like race, I'm using it to describe how we have been racialized or how we've been conditioned to think in terms of race rather than using it as a real thing. So, for example, if I said, oh, some people want to keep supremacy of the white race, I'm not really claiming that there's such a thing as the white race. Like, that's nonsense. Biologically, there's no such thing as the white race. But it is a thing in terms of we have socially constructed a white race so that people think in terms of there being a white race and a black race and so on. So same way, sometimes I use the term white working class. Like I was chatting to a guy on the street yesterday about these things. And I used the term then white working class. But I think when I said it, I might have prefaced it by with the so-called. So I think I might have said the so-called white working class have been made to think that all their problems are there because they're white. And so I said so-called because I'm kind of calling into question, are they really the white working class or are they just the working class? I don't want to be too dogmatic about it, but I also want to take every thought captive for Christ. And if there's any language that I think hinders our understanding of the image of God, then I want to gently deal with that with the person I'm talking to, but in the most sensitive way.